A time comes when no one dares to speak, turns a blind eye, when fear reigns supreme. Times like these, there has to be someone who can bare his soul and walk the distance, alone. Alone with fire burning in his soul. A fighter who is always left with that one last battle to conquer. (1757), the fields of Palasi. The last Nawab of independent Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla, lost a fighting battle with Lord Clive. This was the beginning of the end of freedom. (1857), Indian sepoys declared mutiny against the existing British establishment. This was considered the country's first stirring against British rule. The Indigo Revolt, the Santhal Rebellion, the revolt of the farmers, rebellion of the Kool tribe. The country, and especially its subaltern milieu, were putting up a stiff fight against the shackles of British dominance. Vande Mataram, Vande Mataram, Vande Mataram, Vande Mataram, Vande Mataram. Nattabhinay Niyantran Ain, the Arms Act, the Ilbert Bill, the Press Act. The British were trying hard to stifle the country's rising voice against foreign oppression. In the state of Maharashtra, Basudev Balwant Phadke chose armed revolution to fight the British. 1885, the Indian National Congress is founded. By this time, the dream of a free nation had seeped into the very soul of this great country. Freedom was not just a mere hope, it was the throbbing ambition of a nation. Freedom was a necessity that had to be achieved either through discussion and debate or extremism and violence. 1886, the birth of Rashbehari Bose. Rashbehari Bose was born in the village of Shubaldoho in Bengal's Bardhaman district. His father, Binod Bihari Bose, worked in the local press. Rashbehari lost his mother, Bhuvaneshwari Devi, at the tender age of 4. In 1890, Binod Bihari, along with his family, migrated to Chandannagar, which was then under French rule, and the young Rashbehari was admitted to Dupleix College. In these formative years of his life, he came under the strong influence of his teacher, Charuchandra Rai, who helped in shaping his ideas about the country's ongoing struggle for freedom. His growing fondness for friends like Kanailal Datto, Srish Chandra Ghosh further kindled the revolutionary spirit. In the year 1904, Rashbehari moved to Kolkata and got admitted in Morton College. It was here that he first met the revolutionary Jyotindranath Mukhopadhyay, also known as Bagha Jyotin. For the 18-year-old Rashbehari, this was his first direct initiation into the fervent and passionate world of freedom fighters. The young mind was inspired by the fiercely radical nationalist sentiments of the time, advocating violent extremism to regain the country's lost freedom. Revolutionaries in Bengal and the rest of the country concurred with the idea of taking up arms against British rule. The Anushilan Shomiti was formed in Kolkata, training youth in the use of weapons and assembling of bombs. Abhinav Bharat in Maharashtra had undertaken the secret mission of gathering weapons to fight the British administration. The likes of Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai, Madan Lal Dhingra, Savarkar and Aurobindo Ghosh were inspiring the country's youth with their nationalist zeal. In a time like this, it was only evident that the young Rashbehari would get increasingly attracted to radical and extremist notions of liberating his fettered country. The year 1905. Lord Curzon declares the Partition of Bengal, a decision that is often attributed to the British administration's growing concern for the country's rising spirit of nationalism. The partition was likely to enable the British administration to dilute and eventually suppress the voice of freedom. This made way for widespread boycott of British goods and gave birth to the Swadeshi movement. Joining this fierce outcry against the proposed partition were the likes of Rabindranath Tagore, Chittaranjan Das, Aurobindo Ghosh and Brahmananda Upadhyay. Protest was in the air. Students were protesting against the predominance of English in the education system. Women abandoned their cloistered existence and came out to protest. And more the administration came down hard on the protesters, the more it ignited the spirit of this virulent aggression against the British Raj. In 1906, Rashbehari left Kolkata for Dehradun to take up a job at the Forest Research Institute. Was it the end of the road for this revolutionary? Perhaps not. The young Rashbehari had his mind set on bigger plans. Plans to launch an armed revolution across the country, to attack its various military outposts. Rashbehari Bose envisioned a military coup stretching from Singapore to Kabul as part of his elaborate plan to regain freedom. About this time, the British government was cracking down on revolutionaries in Bengal. Khudiram Bose had been hanged. Barindra Ghosh and Ullashkar Dotto were deported for their involvement in the Alipur bombing incident. Anushilon Shomiti and Jugantar were banned. To counter the reigning atrocities, freedom fighters targeted and killed police and other government officials. Rashbehari Bose's close friend Kanai Lal shot dead Naren Goswami, a prime witness in the Alipur bombing case, inside the jail premise. 12th December 1911. The proposed partition of Bengal was withdrawn. In 1912, the capital of the British Raj was shifted from Kolkata to Delhi. What unfolded in the coming days was perhaps one of the most turbulent times in the history of the country's struggle for independence, and Rashbehari Bose became an integral part of that fight for freedom. Around this time, he initiated plans for the assassination of Governor-General Lord Hardinge. Monindranath Nayak from Chandannagar was entrusted with the role of assembling the bomb for the planned attack. 23rd December 1912. A resplendent Lord Hardinge on elephant back was part of a grand procession at the inauguration of the new capital at Delhi. And at this very congregation, Bashanta Bishwas hurled a bomb at the Governor-General from the veranda of a house in Delhi's Chandni Chowk. The attack left a severely injured Hardinge and killed one of his many minions. As a result of Rashbehari's immaculate and skillful planning, for almost 2 years, the police and other investigating officials were unaware of his involvement in the attack. in 1914, Rashbehari's name finally surfaced after the arrest and interrogation of other members of his revolutionary group. While Bashanta Biswas was arrested, Rashbehari managed to escape to Dhaka under the cover of a new name and identity. He was declared an outlaw, and a bounty of rupees 1 lakh was announced for his capture. The year 1915. Rashbehari discloses to friends in Benares his plans for an armed coup between Singapore and Kabul. He started spreading his revolutionary ideas throughout the country. Lahore, Meerut, Rawalpindi, the army camps of Ambala, and the entire stretch of North India came under his purview. Rashbehari's mass revolution was aptly planned at a time when the British were preoccupied with their involvement in the First World War. It was initially decided that the rebellion would commence on 21st February 1915, led by 2 battalions of the Punjab Regiment and the rest of the army joining at a later stage. But a persistent fear of the mission being unmasked before its commencement forced its leaders to reschedule it for the 19th of February. Despite all precautions, the plan was revealed and the coup mercilessly throttled. The revolutionaries were arrested, with 17 of them being sentenced to death, and the rest were deported. Yet again, 23-year-old Rashbehari evaded arrest and fled under a pseudonym and identity. May 1915. Priyanath Tagore was headed for Japan on the ship Sarukimaru. His passport declared the 5'6" tall Indian Hindu student as a relative of the poet Rabindranath Tagore. But in reality, he was none other than Rashbehari Bose, in perfect disguise on his way to Japan, from where he was hoping to continue his next phase of revolutionary activities. On 31st May, from Hong Kong, he collected his official permit to enter Japan and in the next few days reached Tokyo. In Tokyo, Rashbehari met Lala Lajpat Rai and the Chinese revolutionary Sun Yat-sen. An almost penniless Rashbehari, with no knowledge of local Japanese dialect, was under constant fear of being deported back to India. Around this time, he was greatly helped by Mitsuru Toyamare, a leader of Japan's Black Dragon Society, and was provided shelter at the house of Iezo Somare, the owner of a bread factory. In 1918, Rashbehari married Iezo Somare's daughter Toshiko. He was constantly on the move and kept changing houses in order to evade constant British surveillance. With help from the Somare family, he plunged into his struggle to liberate his country with renewed vigor. In order to earn his living, Rashbehari Bose started delivering lessons on Indian culinary art. 1921 onwards, Rashbehari became a prolific writer, publishing in various Japanese newspapers articles on India's need and struggle for freedom. He opened up dialogues and interaction with several sections of the Japanese community, as it became increasingly clear to him that in order to provide the right impetus to India's armed revolution, it was extremely important to gain support from other countries. He started arranging public meetings in order to voice his thoughts, and in 1923, the Japanese Crown Prince was completely enthralled by one of his speeches. Rashbehari was gaining success in convincing the educated class that India's freedom was not just important for the country, but equally significant for the rest of the human race in its mission to achieve peace and progress. In 1924, Rashbehari was visited by Rabindranath Tagore. Earlier, Tagore had sent some money for Rashbehari when his house was destroyed in one of Tokyo's ravaging earthquakes. Tagore and Rashbehari spent 3 days in the company of each other discussing matters related to the country's freedom movement. In 1924, Rashbehari also created the Indian Independence League, and it was in this very year that he lost his wife, his most worthy partner, Toshiko, leaving behind a son and a daughter. In the next 13 years of his life, Rashbehari was completely immersed in his fight for India's freedom and his protest against Europe's general dominance in the rest of Asia. He founded the League of Asian Nations and the Indo-Japanese Society for Mutual Cooperation. The Second World War started in 1939, and Japan got actively involved in the war. 17 January 1941. Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, who was under house arrest, escaped and reached Germany via Peshawar, Kabul and Moscow. On 25th April 1942, Rashbehari wrote, "I was a fighter once, and I still have a battle to fight, the last and the greatest." And hence, the man plunged into the last and perhaps the greatest battle of his life, the battle to regain his country's freedom through hardcore military operations. He formed the Indian National Army, INA, comprising of Indians who were part of the British Army and retained in Japan as prisoners of war. INA started functioning as the military wing of the Indian Independence League. Around this time, Rashbehari's health began to suffer. A man who had spent a good part of his life fighting and evading the British was finding it increasingly difficult to combat the ravages of time. Perhaps he was realizing the need to race against time. In 1942, Rashbehari Bose published 5 books. One among them was a translation of Ramayana in Japanese language. 13th May 1943. Responding to Rashbehari's invitation, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose reached Japan, having undertaken a 3-month voyage from Germany on a submarine. On 25th August, in Singapore, Rashbehari Bose transferred the reins of the Indian National Army to Subhash Chandra Bose.
I told you that I would be back in about 6 weeks, and I am here now. Friends and comrades in arms, you might ask me what I did in Tokyo for what present I have brought for you. Well, I have brought for you this present. देशभक्त की जय, आजाद हिंदुस्तान। श्री रासबिहारी जी बोस पूर्वी एशिया की जंग आजादी की नुमाइंदों, बहनों और भाइयों।
21st October, the Azad Hind government was formed and ratified by 9 countries. The Japanese government transferred power of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands to the Azad Hind government. What commenced was indeed the last and perhaps the greatest war initiated by Rashbehari Bose. In the same year, he published a Japanese translation of Rabindranath Tagore's Sheshir Kobita. 1944. Azad Hind Fauj declared war against the British and entered the Indian territory. A soldier of the Japanese army, Masahide or Ashoka, died in the Okinawa War. He was the son of Rashbehari Bose. Japan was losing ground in the Second World War, and the exhausted Japanese army at times had to use resources of the Azad Hind Fauj to demand their wartime needs. Rashbehari Bose was suffering from a severe attack of tuberculosis. Was the fighter giving up? Was he still hoping for that one last fight? January 1945. The sun was setting in the land of the rising sun. Tuberculosis had weakened his lungs, which collapsed after one last breath. It was the end of Rashbehari Bose. A Japanese citizen, an Indian by birth, a man who was fond of introducing himself as Indojin, the Indian Bose. His last rites were performed at the Jojoji temple. The fighter was put to rest in Tama, almost 5,000 kilometers from his birthplace in Bardhaman. The government of Japan honored him with the second merit of the rising sun. Thereafter, in the August of 1945, America dropped the nuclear bomb on Japan. The country was shattered. The battered soldiers of the Azad Hind Fauj had to surrender arms. Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose was declared missing in the aftermath of an air crash. The Second World War came to an end with the surrender of Japan in September. In November, Delhi witnessed the trials of the soldiers of the Indian National Army founded by Rashbehari Bose. It was also the time when the British realized that India had to be freed from its foreign shackles. In 1947, Rashbehari Bose's dream of a free nation finally came into being. India gained its freedom, but at the cost of being divided.
জীবন কেটেছে মাটিতে জন্ম নিলাম মাটি তাই রক্তে মিশেছে আকাশের অঝোর ধারে বনানীর শ্যামল ভারে আকাশের অঝোর ধারে বনানীর শ্যামল ভারে অরুণের সোনার রঙে আমার মাটি আজ সেজেছে মাটিতে জন্ম নিলাম